Arnaud Develay is a political consultant, author, and international human rights attorney. I believe this is the first time we've had the opportunity to meet, in which case I'm honoured that Arnaud is on the Mother of All Talk shows this evening. Arnaud, thanks for joining us. I said right at the beginning of the show that the three things that we used to be told in school, told by our parents in my case, that we stood for was democracy, human rights, and freedom of speech. All three of them are being severely tested, at least to say the very least, right now, aren't they? What future for them, Arnaud?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, George. It's an honor. I've been a big fan of you ever since your searing rebuttal 20 years ago on the U.S. Senate floor. And, kudos to you. It's interesting because we find the same individuals 20 years later in a different context, albeit with some variation. But whether it's what you've been doing or what people like Scott Ritter, who we may refer to him because he was arguing against the WMDs before Joe Biden in a memorable event. And so in that respect, thank you again. And to answer to your question, I think it's a constant struggle. The machine, as your previous guest referred to it, the war machine, is a freight train, which has no time to consider itself into ethical values. And so it is up to us, civil society actors, to exercise due diligence as much as possible, notwithstanding, the difficulties that this may engender. And free speech is, one of the key features of, advocacy. And if we cannot call a spade, then there's no point in pushing forward any kind of agenda. And so it's those are heady times, and we need to basically understand that a lot is at stake these days. And people have to basically understand that democracy is not just but a concept that one puts on a wall like a portrait or a painting. Robert Dahl, in his essay on democracy, stressed that much. You need to be involved. You need to be a citizen. You need to remain informed, understand what the issues of our times are, and get involved. No matter what happens, get involved. If not for yourself, do it for your children.
Human rights attorney Arnaud, I was just asking you before we were rudely interrupted if there's anything left of democracy, human rights, and free speech in the West today.
Well, George, in thus far as people being bent on protecting, defending their freedoms, and free speech is one of the most cardinal of those freedoms, a freedom without which advocacy cannot be effective. I believe that, there's always hope. And as I was referring to before we got so rudely interrupted, Robert Dahl wrote an essay called On Democracy, in which he basically said that democracy as a concept must be nurtured and tended to. Democracies cannot be just left on the shelf and admired once in a while. You have to basically participate in the public debate, the res publica. You need to remain informed, and as a citizen of the state, you need to participate to the fullest. If you don't do it for yourself, at least do it for your children. They will thank you for it.
Freedom of speech is the cornerstone, isn't it? Because you can't have a democracy if you can't freely argue for your point of view. And that freedom of speech, once in the hands of a tiny handful of oligarchs, it now turns out is in the hand of a slightly larger and different group of oligarchs, but with the same cast of mind, that you can freely speak about who should be the dog catcher in your town, maybe even freely speak about whether your tax should be a cent or a penny or two less or more. But on the great international issues of conflict and interest, you may not speak freely after all.
Well, this is basically what the system would like people to believe. But we've seen, as your previous guest mentioned, that the Vietnam War eventually was brought to an end because of the constant mobilization of civil society and people at large. To be sure, the system tried to asepticize and clean up the perception of the masses of people by proceeding with the embedding of journalism and by making sure that none of the casualties were to be filmed being brought back at night on military airports. So the system learns from its own mistakes, but ultimately the internal contradictions are such that they will not be able to keep postponing and keep reframing the issues alongside their needs. When the defense budget of a country outlast the defense budget of the 10 next countries, obviously there's got to be somebody who gets left on the pavement. And medical care is an issue, education is an issue, inflation is an issue now as we see it in the wake of the backfiring of the heaviest and most substantial sanction program ever inflicted on a country, i.e. Russia, in time of peace, to make sure, to underline it. And the whole ship now is collapsing. It's almost like trying to put on a suit and it's actually too small for you. And they are panicking right now. They are trying to somehow keep control of the entire narrative. But as the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with a good intention. And they are finding out right now that it's the machine. That they are themselves.
Tell me this,
now completely.
Arnaud, you're amongst your many, many other accomplishments and your writing, possibly the most famous of them, but you're also an attorney. Whatever happened to international law? We have the ICJ, which is referred to by the British government officially as a foreign court. Even though we were actually one of the founders of it, have had a justice on it, and are signatories to it. It's now dismissed as a foreign court. What about the decision of the ICJ that Israel was plausibly committing genocide and gave them 30 days to prepare for trial? Whatever happened to that?
Well, I think it's a symptom of a larger problem. And you may recall that the United States federal government officials are now referring to the rule-based system as opposed to the UN Charter system, thereby leaving everybody else kind of holding the bag in disbelief as to what exactly the rule-based system means. And this is something that we've seen the last 25, 30 years, these constant assault on the rule of law as a general concept. Once the rule of law disappears, we talk often about the unipolar moment. The United States might have had the opportunity to be this paragon of law-abiding citizen in the international arena had they had enlightened leadership 30 years ago. They might have preserved for themselves some sense of legitimacy as the way they perceive themselves, this indispensable nation. Unfortunately, the craving for power and power's sake eventually won out the day, and all the great principle and great proclamation that once upon a time used to be the sloganeering, of U.S. elites, has completely been put aside. And I think you and I will remember that the leading up to the war in Iraq was a watershed moment in the dismantling of the international order. And to the extent a powerful state, if not an hegemon, engages in violating international law in such an egregious manner, obviously it opens up the proverbial can of worms. And this is where we are right now, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, neither the US nor Israel are signatories to the International Criminal Court. Yet both this evening are heavily leaning on the ICC to stop them from issuing arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's come to something. I mean, there's contempt of court and there's real contempt of court, isn't there?
Yeah, it also shows that the ICC, unfortunately, seems to have been more engineered and created for the collective West, as we call it today, to go after its targeted opponents in the international arena. I mean, obviously, a good case could be made that a lot of African heads of states have been singled out by this institution. And there was never quite a rectification brought to it. And it's almost a miracle that the membership remains the way it is. In the context of Ukraine, it's also very interesting to see the rush with which the office of the prosecutor of the ICC basically lent all its resources to the collective West to go out on a junket and look for Russian war crime, therefore feeding into the narrative that the Russians were not obeying the Geneva Convention, for instance. So increasingly, the ICC
one law for us
now looks, yes, one law for us and one law for the others. And we saw the speed and the rush with which an international arrest warrant was issued against Russian Federation President Vladimir Putin on some very shady accusations. I won't get into it on this program, but in the light of what we've seen the last 6 months, it's almost an absurd notion that no warrant would be issued against Benjamin Netanyahu, especially in the wake of the findings of the ICJ.
Arnaud, my apologies for the interruption in our flow. We'll have you back again when there are fewer interventions in normal service. Thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows.